I've never been good with goodbyes, but I think this is the last thing I have left. If anyone is reading this, please don't let my voice be lost. I am, or was, Elisa, a nurse, 27 years old, a life that feels far too small in the face of everything I've experienced in these last few months. Working at that underground clinic was my biggest mistake, but at the time, it felt like my only option. I was drawn in by the easy paycheck, the anonymity, and the promises that nothing would get out of control. But things like that always spiral out of control, don't they? There, I saw things no one should ever have to see. Transactions in brown envelopes, people walking into rooms and never coming out, and documents, so many documents, that held more power than any weapon. I knew too much, and knowing too much in that clinic was the same as signing a death sentence. I ran. Or at least, I tried to run. That night, I had a folder filled with document copies hidden inside my coat. It was raining, and the city felt suffocating under the red and yellow glow of headlights. But they knew. They always know. A black car followed me for several blocks before hitting me. I remember the sound of metal bending, glass shattering, and the warm sensation of blood running down my face. But against all odds, I survived. And that's how I ended up in this hospital. I was supposed to be safe here, right? But safety is a fragile concept when you carry information that could bring down powerful people. In the first few days, I just wanted to recover, but then, things started happening. At first, it was little things. The wrong medication here, a meal I was sure I hadn't ordered there. I thought it was paranoia, that maybe the trauma was messing with my mind. But then I started noticing the looks. Nurses who avoided eye contact, doctors who hesitated before answering my questions. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night with an intense pain in my arm. My vein was swollen, and the foreline looked tampered with. I called a nurse, but the woman who walked into my room wasn't wearing a badge, didn't say her name, and her eyes, there was something wrong with those eyes. She adjusted the four quickly and left without saying a word. I lay there, frozen, feeling my heart race. That's when I started paying attention to the security cameras in the hallway. They were supposed to blink a red light every few seconds, but that night, they were dark. I'm no expert, but even I know that wasn't normal. I asked the only nurse who seemed trustworthy to check the system, but he came back a few minutes later saying everything was fine. He was lying. I knew he was. Something changed in me that night. For the first time, I was certain someone wanted to finish what the black car had started. I needed to get out of that hospital, but I could barely stand, let alone escape. And then, that same night, it happened. I was almost asleep when I heard my room door creak open, very slowly. It wasn't the usual sound of night rounds or staff checking on patients. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying to enter unnoticed. I froze completely, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst through my chest. The dim light from the hallway partially illuminated the room, and that's when I saw it, a silhouette standing in the doorway. The person didn't move, just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then they began to approach. I couldn't see their face, but I saw the cold glint of something in their hand, a syringe. My mind screamed at me to get up, to scream, to do something, but my body felt paralyzed. At the last second, I made the only move I could, I threw myself off the side of the bed and hit the floor. The pain was excruciating, but the sound of the syringe piercing the mattress where I had been lying was enough to keep me conscious. The man cursed under his breath, and then I heard hurried footsteps leaving the room. Still on the floor, I crawled until I could press the emergency button. No one came. The button simply didn't work. Somehow, they had disabled that too. I stayed there for several minutes, breathing heavily, trying to understand what had just happened. I couldn't trust anyone in that place anymore. I was alone, completely alone. I don't know how much time passed before I finally managed to drag myself back into bed. Every movement felt like it was tearing my muscles apart, and the air felt too heavy to breathe. I stared at the door for hours, waiting for someone, maybe that man to return, maybe a nurse, maybe nothing. The hospital was unbearably silent, like it had been abandoned. When daylight began to filter in and I heard the first signs of movement in the hallway, I felt a little safer. But that feeling disappeared as soon as a nurse walked into my room holding a syringe. It was different from the syringe from the night before, but something in her eyes froze me in place again. She smiled, that artificial smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and said she needed to administer a new medication, that the doctor had left specific instructions. I refused. I said I wanted to speak to the doctor first, that I wouldn't take anything until he came personally. She insisted, her voice growing firm, almost authoritative. But something in my face must have shown her I was about to start screaming, because she stopped, slipped the syringe back into her coat pocket, and left without another word. The moment she was gone, I started frantically searching the nearby drawers, looking for something, anything, that could help me. That's when I found a sheet of paper and a pen at the bottom of a locked drawer. I don't know why, but at that moment, I felt like I had to write. Write everything. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't going to leave that hospital alive. My hands shook as I began to write. Every word felt like a small confession, as if I was leaving behind something that might survive even if I didn't. I wrote about the underground clinic, about the documents, about the murders I had witnessed, and about the night I tried to escape. I wrote everything, leaving nothing out. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finished, I folded the paper and hid it under the pillow. If someone came looking for me later, if someone was brave enough to search that room, at least the truth would be there. When night fell again, I realized I couldn't endure another dawn. Every shadow seemed to move, every tiny sound made me jump. And then, around 2 in the morning, the door burst open. This time, there was no caution. A man entered, wearing a surgical mask and a hood. He said nothing, didn't hesitate. In seconds, he was on me, one hand pressed against my throat while the other held another syringe. I fought, I struggled, I tried to scream, but my lungs couldn't pull in air. Everything started to darken, and in that moment, I realized it was the end. When I woke up, or rather, when my consciousness returned, everything was different. I couldn't feel my body. I was still in the room, but somehow, I wasn't. I saw my own body on the bed, pale, lifeless. The syringe lay on the floor, a small trail of liquid dripping from the needle. He had succeeded. They had finally silenced me. But somehow, I was still here. Or something of me was. My vision blurred as if I were fading, but before everything went black, I focused on the pillow where I had hidden the paper. It was the only thing that could guarantee justice, some form of redemption. All I could hope for was that someone, a nurse, a patient, even a janitor, would find it. That someone would read it and understand what had happened. That someone would have the courage to carry that message forward. Because even after everything, even after the end, I knew those words were the only thing left of me. I never used to believe in ghost stories, but after that night, I can't step into a hospital without feeling my stomach churn. I was a resident at St. Vincent's Hospital, working exhausting shifts, spending entire nights caring for patients who often didn't even notice my presence. John, the janitor, was one of those people everyone sees but no one really looks at. A thin, slightly hunched man, always wearing a faded cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't talk much, only mumbled quick answers and kept moving with his broom or mop. Sometimes, I'd see him standing in empty hallways, staring at nothing. Back then, I thought it was just exhaustion or some personal issue. How wrong I was. Things started getting strange when patients began disappearing. These weren't typical runaways, no one just walks out of a hospital unnoticed, especially in the middle of the night. There were no records, cameras were, conveniently, offline, and no plausible explanations. I mentioned it to other residents, but everyone was too busy or too tired to pay attention. Then I started noticing a pattern. Every time a patient vanished, John was on duty. It was always him cleaning the halls on those nights, always him wearing those rubber gloves that seemed longer than they should be. That's when I decided to pay closer attention to him, though I had no idea what I was about to uncover. The following night, I kept an eye on John. I pretended to be organizing files in the residence room, but in reality, I was watching the security cameras on the computer. Some were offline, which wasn't surprising, but one in particular showed the corridor leading to the basement. I saw John walking through it, pushing a cleaning cart, but the way he glanced around before opening a specific door put me on edge. That door hadn't been used in months and was supposedly locked. I waited until he disappeared inside before heading down the stairs, my heart pounding so hard it felt like the entire hospital could hear it. The basement hallway was damp, with flickering lights and a strange smell in the air, a mix of cleaning products and something heavier, almost metallic. I reached the door John had entered. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see a faint glow coming from within. I took a deep breath and slowly pushed it open. What I saw inside still haunts me to this day. It was a small, claustrophobic room with makeshift shelves and stacks of plastic boxes. Inside those boxes, I saw things I will never be able to forget, personal belongings of missing patients, glasses, jewelry, even clothes folded with a morbid precision. In the corner of the room, on a rusty table, there were scalpels, surgical gloves stained with something dark, and plastic containers filled with remnants I didn't dare examine closely. My breath caught in my throat. Every inch of that room screamed that I shouldn't be there. I stepped back, trying to leave quietly, but my leg bumped into a box that fell to the floor with a loud crash. The sound echoed down the empty hallway, and in that moment, I knew I had just signed my death sentence. I heard hurried footsteps approaching the door, heavy and determined. Before I could react, John appeared in the doorway, his face partially hidden in the shadows, but his eyes gleamed with a mix of rage and something almost animalistic. He didn't say anything, he just stared at me for a few seconds that felt like hours. Then, he stepped forward, closing the door behind him. Instinctively, I turned and ran. I ran without looking back, tripping over boxes, slipping on the damp floor. The hallway felt endless, and John's footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder and closer with every second. I don't know how, but I made it to the stairs. I stumbled up, practically dragging myself, while the sound of his boots followed relentlessly behind me. When I finally reached the ground floor, the hospital felt empty. No nurses, no patients, just that oppressive silence I was starting to become familiar with. I ran to the reception desk, but the area was deserted. The main door was locked, the lights turned off. It was as if the entire hospital was conspiring against me, as if no one could hear me. I hid behind a row of chairs in the waiting area, trying to steady my breathing while I listened to John's heavy footsteps approaching. He wasn't running anymore. Now he was walking slowly, dragging his feet across the polished floor, as if he knew exactly where I was. The only thing separating us was that fragile plastic chair barrier. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to muffle the sound of my breath, but it felt useless. For a moment, everything went silent. A silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, John whispered something, low, almost like an off-key lullaby, but I couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, the corridor lights flickered and came back on with full force. It was enough to give me the courage to get up and run again. I didn't look back, didn't think, I just ran. I found an unlocked side door near the pediatric wing and bolted outside. The sensation of the cold night air hitting my face almost made me cry. I sprinted across the empty parking lot, stumbling over rocks and my own feet, until I reached the main gate. It was locked, but there was just enough space underneath for me to crawl through. On the other side, I collapsed onto the asphalt. When I looked back, John was standing in the doorway of the hospital, motionless, just watching me. His silhouette was nothing more than a shadow against the dim light of the corridor. Then, he simply turned around and disappeared back inside the hospital. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Somehow, I made it to a nearby police station, still in shock, my knees scraped and my hands trembling. The police took my story seriously, or at least, that's what they told me at the time. A team was dispatched to the hospital that very night. I sat in a cold room with a blanket draped over my shoulders, waiting for news. Hours later, an officer walked in with a strange expression on his face. They had searched the basement of the hospital but found no sign of the room I had been in. There were no boxes, no scalpels, and no trace of John. Just an empty corridor and a door that, according to them, had been padlocked shut for years. They said John hadn't shown up for his shift that night or in the days following. His locker was empty, and the only record they found was an outdated employee file. No photo, no fixed address, nothing that could indicate who he really was. The police tried to convince me that I must have been overwhelmed, that perhaps the trauma had distorted my perception. But I know what I saw. That room existed. Those macabre relics existed. And John. John is still out there, somewhere. Maybe in another hospital, maybe in another city. Sometimes, I find myself wondering how many people might have crossed his path without ever suspecting. I just hope someone, somewhere, notices the signs before it's too late. I never imagined that my love for nursing could put me in danger. I always saw hospitals as places of healing, where science and care walked hand in hand. But on that rainy night, between the sound of water dripping against the windows and the almost sepulchral silence of the empty hallways, everything changed. I was in the records room, looking for a medical file that had been urgently requested. The hospital lights tended to flicker during heavy rain, and it always put me on edge. That's when I heard muffled voices in the room next door. One voice was deep, Dr. Alexander, the most respected surgeon in the hospital, and the other was one I couldn't identify. Curious, I crept closer to the slightly open door, just enough to peek inside without being noticed. What I saw made me freeze. Dr. Alexander, the hospital's most esteemed surgeon, was standing next to a patient who, as far as I knew, was recovering and about to be discharged. But he wasn't checking vital signs or adjusting the foredrip. He held a syringe filled with an amber liquid and, with surgical precision, injected it directly into the patient's catheter. The monitors began beeping almost immediately. My mind screamed at me to do something, to rush into the room, but my body wouldn't respond. I just stood there, paralyzed, watching as the patient convulsed for a few seconds and then, silence. Dr. Alexander turned off the monitors, covered the body with a sheet, and calmly walked out of the room without even glancing sideways. It wasn't until the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway that I could breathe again. My hands were trembling so much that I dropped several files on the floor. Every beat of my heart echoed in my ears, drowning out even the sound of the rain outside. My first instinct was to run away from there, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. When I finally managed to move, I went straight to the nurse's break room. I shut the door behind me, locked it, and leaned against the sink, trying to steady my breathing. My mind was spinning with questions. Why did he do that? What was in that syringe? Did anyone else know? But above all, one certainty gnawed at me: I needed to report this. I couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. The next day, I wrote a detailed report and went to the clinical director. But as soon as I started speaking, he interrupted me with a cold smile and a flimsy excuse about misunderstandings and common mistakes during night shifts. He didn't even look at my report. When I left his office, I felt more alone than ever. And that's when things started to get really strange. First, I found a note in my locker. The crumpled paper was scrawled with shaky letters: "Curious nurses don't live long." Then, during a night shift, I noticed that the medication I was supposed to administer to a patient had been switched. If I hadn't double-checked, it would have caused a severe allergic reaction. Coincidence? It didn't feel like it. I began to feel eyes on me in the shadows of the hallways, to hear footsteps behind me when I was alone. And always, in those moments, I thought about the vacant stare of that patient and the calm expression on Dr. Alexander's face as he turned off the machines. The following days were pure hell. It felt like the entire hospital was against me. Colleagues I used to talk to started avoiding me, looking away when I walked past. Some whispered to each other but fell silent the moment I approached. Every night shift felt like walking through a minefield. I checked and rechecked every medication 3-4 times before administering it, afraid someone had tampered with something. But the worst part was the constant feeling of being watched. Sometimes, I'd glance at my reflection in the windows and swear I saw a shadow standing still at the end of the hallway. When I turned to look directly, there was no one there. My sleep became non-existent, my meals consisted of cold coffee and stale bread. I was at my breaking point. That night, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I spent hours printing documents, gathering evidence, recording everything I knew in audio. Then, I hid everything in an envelope and placed it somewhere safe outside the hospital. If anything happened to me, someone would find it. I just needed one last piece to confirm my suspicions. I waited until all the hallways were empty, until the only sounds were the distant beeping of monitors and the faint rustle of rain against the windows. Then, I went down to the supply floor, near the isolation wing. That was the only place where the records could be. But when I got there, I realized I wasn't alone. I heard muffled voices coming from the far end of the hallway, near the medical records room. I recognized one voice immediately. It was Dr. Alexander. My heart nearly stopped when I heard that deep voice echoing down the corridor. I hid behind a shelf of medications and held my breath. Dr. Alexander was talking to someone else, I couldn't see who, but the voice was firm, authoritative. They spoke about damage control, risk of exposure, and something about a patient who shouldn't have survived. My mind was working too fast, piecing together fragments I didn't even realize were connected. It wasn't just Dr. Alexander. It was an entire network. Doctors, maybe even administrators. An organization hidden behind white coats and sterile hospital hallways. The voices started to fade, but before they disappeared completely, I heard something that froze me to the core. Nurse Carla knows too much. This ends tonight. That was all I needed to hear. I waited a few seconds after they left and sprinted back down the empty hallways. But it felt like the hospital had turned into a maze. Every hallway looked the same, every door was locked. Suddenly, I heard fast footsteps behind me. I turned my head for a second and saw someone, a man in a lab coat, walking toward me with something shiny in his hand. A syringe. I ran with every ounce of strength I had, turning corners, slipping into empty rooms, until I found a small surgical supply closet. I locked the door from the inside, leaned against the wall, and tried not to make a sound. From the other side of the door, I heard a firm knock and a low voice, "Open up, Carla. It doesn't have to be this way." After sending emails with all the evidence, I sat in that uncomfortable chair, my hands still trembling, my eyes fixed on the computer screen. I knew that, somehow, they would find out I had escaped. I had to disappear. I left the internet cafe and walked through empty streets until I found a cheap hotel downtown. The receptionist barely looked at me as I paid up front for one night. In the tiny room, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mold, I finally collapsed. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just lay there on the bed, staring at the stained ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of distant sirens. I turned on the small TV in the corner of the room. The news reported an anonymous tip that had exposed a criminal scheme involving illegal surgeries, organ trafficking, and staged deaths at St. Vincent's Hospital. Dr. Alexander's name was plastered across the screen. Other doctors were mentioned too, and I knew at that moment that, even if they tried to cover it up again, that network would never operate the same way. But part of me knows the fight isn't over. People like Dr. Alexander don't just disappear. They hide, regroup, and find new victims. As for me, I never went back to that city. I changed my name, my life, and I try to forget. But sometimes, in the quietest nights, I still hear footsteps behind me. I still see shadows lingering in the corners of hallways when I close my eyes. Because deep down, I know they're still out there. And I know that, if they get the chance, they'll come for me again.